College football nerds here talking Oregon and Washington. Huge game in the Pac-12. And this year, huge game with national championship potential implications because these two teams are 5-0. Deep into the season, got some undefeated Pac-12 teams, and we're going to talk about it. Want to remind y'all, please like, please subscribe. Helps us out a ton. Please share this content where you talk football. Message boards, Twitter, also helps us out. And if you are just coming around this time of year, we have released our model. It's free for you to try. You can simulate any two teams and get the same simulations we've been running for years on this channel. And we're going to show you the model, kind of give you a taste of what it's like. But it's free on collegefootballnerds.com. Also have a top 25 that we release every week that we let you vote on. And we compile all of those votes and give what's been a better than AP top 25 this year. Also, we have stats, we have pick'ems, we have NFL use. You can track your favorite college team in the NFL with one click. That's it for the pitch on the site. Now we're going to talk about this game. Josh, we've got Oregon traveling to one of my bucket list places to play, Husky Stadium, Washington. Huskies they play in one of the most beautiful scenes in college football, and I want to go there, but opposing teams don't love going there because it's actually really loud. These two teams get loud in their respective stadiums, and maybe here down here in SEC country, we don't appreciate it as much as we should. What's interesting about that is it's a tough place to play, and Oregon is only a 3-point dog going into this game where I think Washington is higher ranked. They're at home. So Josh, do we think this is a matchup issue? Do we think, why isn't Washington a 6.5 point favorite in this game?
I think the spread here really indicates mostly home field advantage, which is interesting because home field advantage is commonly something like 2 to 3 points. So Vegas is saying this is an even game with basically just probably due to matchups, probably due to the fact that Washington has really nothing too much on paper that is that much more dominant than Oregon, who's a really good team. And to be clear, I feel like the reality for these two teams is that they're also, they're just two of the best teams in the country. We've been behind the scenes running this sort of beta version of a 1 through 133 model, where we can rank all the teams based off running the model against everybody in the country and sort of creating a power rating. These two teams have been top 5 in that. I think they're probably underrated from an AP poll perspective. I think it's kind of silly at this point that, for example, Florida State's number 4, given what we know about LSU, given the way Washington's performed, been one of the more dominant teams in the country. Oregon has performed. The Colorado win was pretty dominant statement, has played well overall. I don't know if you agree with me here, but I really feel like it's a close game just because Vegas thinks both these teams are really, really good. And I don't think you can really take too much of it as a negative for either team.
I think that what's interesting with both of these teams is they score a ton of points, can score a ton of points. I think that coming out of the Arizona game, there were a lot of people going like, what was that? Because people weren't very high on Arizona, but then we saw what Arizona did to Southern Cal last week. Almost beat them, and so maybe that kind of changes the perception a little bit on who these teams are. Also, with the bye week to kind of recover and focus on one opponent, we talk about these types of matchups in other areas. We talked about it with Texas and Oklahoma, Texas and Alabama early at the beginning of the season. But Josh, this feels like the kind of game that maybe you don't feel so terrible if you lose this game as long as you don't get blown out because it's such an epic game and these teams are, poised to have everything else in front of them that maybe even losing this game, your hopes for making the playoffs are still within reach.
I think that's fairly true. The reality is that somebody has to win and somebody has to lose every game in college football. And for these two teams, I think the winner of this team is certainly going to be in a better position to meet their goals for the rest of the year. They're going to be in the driver's seat for a lot of things in the playoff. I'm curious to see how high they rise or fall. My opinion, the winner of this game should be a top 4 team. They should be. I don't think they will. I think that's going to be kind of a miscarriage of justice when that happens. But yeah, the loser of this game, this one loss isn't going to mean much of anything in isolation. It kind of depends on how the rest of the year turns out, but I think everything's still in front of them. I think the more interesting thing to me is just trying to figure out how to really pair these teams up because they are so good and then because they've dominated opposing competition. This is where the relative statistics that we generate, I think, become most useful because, how do you compare one fairly dominant team to another fairly dominant team? Well, you've got to really, really adjust for opponent quality and create something other than just the gaudy numbers they represent. And that's where I think the model starts to come into play.
Yeah, and before we get into the model, I want to make a note about what our relative performance numbers say, and just to quickly kind of explain that, like, there's all of these numbers that you see that you're used to seeing, like yards per game, yards per attempt, and all of the rankings of like this is the number one passing offense in the country. What we've tried to add to that is, okay, you might be the number one offense in the country, number one passing offense, rushing offense, but also where do you rank when we adjust that for how other teams have fared against your opponents? So your expected performance against those teams. And Josh, that's where we might get some insights and where I'm going to lead you into the model, because Washington is way up there in offensive numbers, and Oregon has scored a lot, but relative to their performance, they're in the 20s and teens in terms of who they are offensively. But the big difference is defense. And I think that that's probably what the model is going to bear out too, in that Washington defensively hasn't been great. They've been good. They're in plus numbers relative to their performance, but not great. And Oregon is actually not a team we associate with defense historically, but Lanning's bringing that defensive mind to it, and it's starting to show in these relative performance numbers. So I'll, with the magic of, a little bit of graphic work, I'll have that shown in that segment that I just talked about. But what I'll also show is the model. Why don't you take it away and kind of let's talk about what it sees.
Right. So the idea here being, if somebody played your schedule and, is 6 yards per carry 25% better or 25% worse than the other teams that have played the same composite schedule as you. Just strictly comparing it to other teams that have played those same teams. And that gives you some interesting insights to unit metrics. So our model straight up has 35.5 Oregon, 29.8 Washington. Not just like points per play. There's actually a pretty sophisticated scoring model that's behind that. Generate yardage, then we generate points off that. We create a holistic picture based solely on matchups against each other on how the game looks to go, and then from there we try to predict a score, again based solely on your team and what has been needed to score and how scoring models have worked. So every team has their own unique scoring model. So yards per play here, what I think is interesting is that Washington, it's one of those games, this happens a lot, where Washington is expected to slightly outgain Oregon per play, but Oregon is expected to score more. That essentially reflects, in a sense, consistency. And it's unsurprising. And I think one of the more interesting things in this game is that Penix Jr. and Bo Nix both have a history of consistent inconsistency. Both of them have had games where they don't play at a high level, where they just roll out a clunker, throw interceptions at inopportune times, missing throws that they normally hit. It has been true of them for their entire career. More often than not, they're good quarterbacks, but the not can be quite bad. And what it's saying right now is that Washington's a little more prone to that. And both of these teams are expected to get 7 to 8 yards per attempt. That's not a particularly high number. 7.5 is a competent passing game. So this is really saying they're not going to be overly good at throwing the football. And usually 4 yards per carry is a solid run game. So this is sort of a solid to good run game and an okay pass game from both. And when you look at the unit versus unit version, that's really just saying, okay, with the relative performance statistics, who has the relative edge? And what it's saying is that Washington has the edge on offense, and Oregon has the edge when they're on offense. Both offenses are ahead of the opposing defense. But the difference is, interestingly, Washington is a little, maybe a little more even when it comes to defense. The defense is about even with Oregon's passing attack. But Oregon has a bigger edge in rushing than anywhere Washington has offensively. And to your point, Daniel, when you look at the relative performance statistics for Washington, they're 23rd in passing yards per attempt and 35th in rushing. It hurts passing, helps rushing, just when you account for opponent statistics. Oregon is a little more lopsided. They're 9th in passing and they're 52nd in rushing. And I think what you're seeing here is a reflection of the fact that Washington wants to run the offense through Penix. Using these relative performance statistics, we've created our own version of QB rating that we're calling the Nerd Performance Index, because we're cliche nerds, the NPI. Penix Jr. is first in that metric. And Bo Nix is all the way down at 23rd. The difference is Oregon, in our model's view, is probably a little less reliant on their quarterback than Washington is. And also Bo Nix is maybe a little more apt to generate production in the run game. This NPI is just a measure of passing performance. And so because of that, I think the model is really suggesting that Oregon is going to be able to be a little bit more consistent because they can rely on the run. Their offense is probably more comfortable relying on the run by a little bit than Washington. It's a hard thing to judge. But it gives Oregon the slight edge in scoring, even though it gives Washington the tiniest of margins of advantage in terms of actual yardage.
Yeah, and our model doesn't account for home field advantage. It doesn't account for injuries or anything like that. So that's worth noting that a hostile environment is going to impact this game. It is interesting because if you look at the number, like Penix Jr. is putting up Heisman numbers. Like it is eye-popping, but it also is a little bit concerning based on what you said, that everything has to go through him, right? And that, historically, he's also run the ball a good bit. He did at Indiana, I think, a lot more than he's being asked to here. It's something he's capable of doing, but he hasn't had to, or they really want him to be a pocket passer, which makes sense. I mean, he can easily throw for 400 on somebody and even a good defense. So I get it. But the concern is if Oregon is at all able to take that away, can Washington respond? Now, I think they have a good system too, so they should be able to respond. Maybe it is a situation where they haven't had to yet, but I do think there's some concerns there. And I do think that if you look at who Washington has played this year, they haven't played a team that could expose where there are some defensive issues, right? And that's the problem Washington had last year, was the defense. It wasn't the offense at all. And so even though we have relative performance numbers, there are also situations where if you perform relatively well against a bad team, they're not going to hit any break points for your defense that expose you to the point where it would impact your overall numbers, if that makes sense. So, like, if you play a team that scores 20 points per game and you hold them to 17, okay. But if you play a team that scores 40 points per game and you hold them slightly less than their average, they're still in the 30s. And that's going to affect your overall numbers. And that's going to affect the on-the-field, like, who wins the game kind of numbers. And that's my concern a little bit for Washington, is they just haven't played good offensive teams. And I know Arizona did pretty well against USC's defense, but USC's defense is absolute trash, and Washington doesn't want to be compared to them. So, Josh, in thinking about that a little bit, I know we are very relative performance focused, but what about what we don't know about these two teams? I think that it's a really good thing that Oregon held Colorado to 6 points, because otherwise neither one of these teams has played like great offenses. But that's one data point that sticks in the back of my mind, that we know that Oregon is capable of holding at least a good offense to not a lot of points.
Yeah, that is the one data point, and that's probably why the statistics skew a little bit towards Oregon in pass defense. And I'm going to actually go ahead and transition in my projection there. I do have Oregon in this game. I'm going to pick Oregon 34-31. Scores are always a little arbitrary, but that's about where I have it. I do think it's a close game, and I think it's one anyone can win. But when you look at it statistically, Washington is over 3-1, almost 4-1 pass to run in terms of yardage. This is absolutely a team driven through throwing the ball. Oregon has shown against Colorado, who is, in our metrics, Colorado is a top 15 passing offense. Now, they're not top 15 in anything else, but they are a top 15 passing offense. And Oregon almost completely shut them down. And the funny thing offensively is that while Washington definitely has a more effective rush attack than Colorado does, I mean, it's like a 4.7 yard per carry team that's pretty good. They don't like to run it much. They really haven't. Even though they've been winning games by large margins, they've still been almost entirely throwing the ball. Oregon has shown that they can handle a top 15 type team that is a dominant passing team. That's what Washington is. And so even though Washington, and I'll say, overall passing relative performance, Washington's 5th in the country. They're 16th in relative performance and rushing yard per play, by the way. I mean, still a very good rushing attack. I just have a little bit more confidence that Oregon is going to be able to stop Washington's passing attack, and for that, to me, that's enough to give Oregon a slight edge. Now, no one winning has surprised me, and I will say, if you want my real trigger, I think one of these two quarterbacks is going to throw 2+ interceptions because again, you come back to the consistent inconsistency issue in big games. And I think the one that throws 2+ interceptions is probably going to be the one that loses. I just have more confidence in Oregon being the one that's able to generate those negative plays, and that's why I slightly lean Oregon in this matchup.
So I've got Oregon even bigger, 37-30, and I think that we're going to see, and we've seen in these big games, that even with high-scoring teams, there's fewer possessions and fewer opportunities, and I think that Oregon's going to have an easier time staying on schedule and scoring consistently. To me, there's too much, and look, if Washington wins this game big, I'm not going to be surprised. There's two things that really stick in my head, and because this is all we have to go on. Neither one of these teams has played a great schedule so far. Not their fault. We have a data point in Colorado being held to 6 points in a team that, like you said, loves to throw the ball, can't really run the ball. Everything goes through Shedeur Sanders. Now, I do think that part of that 6 points is because they were just completely dominated at the point of attack in a way that Washington will not be. Their offensive line is not going to be overpowered by Oregon. But then we have another data point that really concerns me, and that's 32 points to Cal. And look, I know Washington scored 59. That game was never in doubt. Cal scored 13 in the fourth quarter. But they did have 500 yards. They had 6 yards per play. And this is a California team that's not good offensively. Scored 10 against Auburn, only scored 31 on Idaho, 24 on Arizona State. Yeah, they put up some points this weekend on Oregon State, but 32 points to Cal tells me that we don't know that Oregon has a bad defense. And I'm not saying they do. But given that there's so much that we don't know about either two of these teams, even though it's week 7, I got to go with what I see and what data points that I do have. And so from that standpoint, I'm going Oregon 37, Washington 30, in spite of it being on the road. But like you said, we could get bad Bo Nix and Washington run away with this because Bo Nix throws 3 interceptions.
Yeah, and I'll note it's Penix. I've probably said that wrong 18 times because that's a bad habit of mine. But yeah, it's a fascinating game to watch. It's also been fascinating to see a lot of the teams they played early, how they've all done relative to others. Oregon having a close game against Texas Tech, not sure how excusable that is. Washington's performances have been largely dominant, but I don't know that Boise's a great team. I don't know that Tulsa's a good team. I don't know that Michigan State's a good team. So it's, I think, going to be important for one team to win this game. And as much as you can say this isn't a total referendum on the season, it's definitely from the immediate poll perspective going to be that one team is probably going to be elevated and the other team is going to be dropped quite a bit. Because I think the national media doesn't have a ton of faith in the Pac-12 due to prior years. I think that's unreasonable. There's a reason our model, which we launched a week and a half ago, week 1, it was 62% against the spread, which beat FPI, SP Plus, and every other model. Probably not sustainable. But the reason to beat every model is we don't use priors. We use this. This is a trend predictor. It's not an absolute score predictor. We want to see things about the team and how they're playing this year. Well, in the post-transfer world, that's become more important than ever because teams aren't really their recruiting rankings anymore. And I think people still have that wrong mindset that they see the Pac-12 as what they were in years prior. And the Pac-12, frankly, has been pulling a ton of transfers in. And these teams have rebuilt themselves in a lot of ways. And you got guys like Penix and a ton of guys in Oregon that came from other programs that were really good players. And so I do think somebody's going to get positive credit. But I think they're probably not going to give as much positive credit as they should to the winner, and they're probably going to give way too much negative feedback to the loser of this game, unfortunately.
Yeah, we saw this with Oklahoma and Texas this weekend. Texas dropped all the way to 9th But even though they have a win over Alabama, who is not maybe Alabama of the past, but it's proven so far that Alabama is definitely a good football team. They beat Alabama on the road. They lose in the very last seconds of the game to who they think is a top 5 team, drop them all the way to 9th. I think that's silly. And I think you're right. The same thing is going to happen in this game, that one of the loser of this game is going to get dropped as long as they don't get blown out. If it's a 1-score game, even if it's like a 10-point game, that team still has time to claw their way back into the playoff discussion. And I think that the Pac-12 has done enough this year, especially if USC can beat Notre Dame, has done enough this year to earn some benefit of the doubt at the end of the season where they previously would not have.
Yeah.
So there are years where a one-loss Pac-12 team would have been immediately out, and I don't think that's the case this year.
Yeah, if you're a Pac-12 fan and you're an Oregon fan or you're a Washington fan, it's going to pain you, but you need to just close your eyes and root for USC, because USC beating Notre Dame is going to be one of the most important things the remainder of the year, really, for both these programs, ironically. In some ways, that actually might be a bigger deal for Washington and Oregon than who wins the Washington-Oregon game. It's bizarre to say, and not completely true, but it is a little bit true.
Yeah, totally agreed there. And the thing about USC is they have kind of dodged Washington and Oregon in years past, and this year they get them back to back. So you're absolutely right, and this is funny because we see this in other, especially in the SEC, where they're like, I'm not rooting for them, I hate them. And people will root against their own interests, and it doesn't matter if you root for somebody or not. They're going to win the game or lose the game regardless. But in terms of being engaged in the playoff discussion, this Notre Dame data point is really big, and if USC can put a number on Notre Dame when Ohio State barely beat Notre Dame last play of the game, that's huge for more than the winner of this game, the loser of Washington, Oregon, because you still control your own destiny at least against Southern Cal, right? So I love that talking point that I didn't even think about until we kind of got going on this. Anything else on this game?
Nope, that's it. And enjoy doing the videos this week, and like and subscribe, guys, if you like it. But yeah.
All right, y'all. That's it for us. Remember, collegefootballnerds.com if you want to play around with this model, see these relative performance statistics. Sign up. It's free. And then, yeah, give us some Pac-12 influence in our weekly top 25. Go vote on that as well. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.